Dr. Christine Kokenauer from UC Davis has the privilege of introducing our president, Dr. Rob Todd.
Good afternoon, members and guests of the Southwestern Surgical Congress. It is a great honor for me to introduce your president, Dr. Samuel Robert Todd, and thank you for allowing me to introduce him through this virtual connection. Rob was born April 1st, 1970, the Chinese Year of the Dog, at St. David's Hospital in Austin, Texas. An Aries, Rob epitomizes the personality traits associated with the zodiac sign. An Aries is a passionate, motivated, and confident leader who builds community with their cheerful disposition and relentless determination. Sound familiar? Dr. Todd also belongs to Generation X. Rob's parents, Bill and Jerry Todd, were living in Austin when Rob was born. His father was at the University of Texas, Austin, working on his PhD in chemical engineering. Rob was the baby of the family, with Gail, his oldest sister, followed by brother Wes and sister Gretchen. Samuel is a family name and was the name of his father's oldest brother. Robert is from his mother's side. Her father went by Bob, which was a name she did not particularly like. As a consequence, Samuel Robert Todd goes by Rob. When Rob was 2, his family moved to Victoria, Texas, where his dad went to work for DuPont. Rob tried Cub Scouts, but that only lasted a year, despite the fancy neckerchief. He graduated from Victoria High School in 1988. Went back to Austin, where he graduated from the University of Texas at Austin in 1992 with a degree in finance and with an area of concentration in chemistry. From there, he went to Texas Tech in Lubbock, where he received his MD in 1996. Continuing to venture a bit further west, he did a surgery residency at Texas Tech El Paso. When he was at William Beaumont in El Paso, he met Karen Kwong and Marty Schreiber, and they became great friends. Rob started his plastic surgery fellowship in July 2001 at UT Houston, but Tropical Storm Allison had hit Houston in June, and the hospital closed until at least mid-August. So no hospital to begin a fellowship. He began to realize that his decision to go into plastic surgery was a mistake. He lasted until Valentine's Day of 2002. After talking to Dr. Edward Saltzstein at Texas Tech, he decided to do critical care. A week later, he started as an attending at Texas Tech. Karen Kwong and Marty Schreiber had left for Oregon in the fall of 2001, and Marty told him to come do the Surgical Critical Care Fellowship at OHSU starting in July 2002. Rob is one of the few surgeons that has worked at many of this country's legendary trauma centers: Herman Hospital, Bellevue Hospital, Ben Taub Hospital, and now Grady. After a surgical critical care fellowship in Portland, he joined Fred Moore, Red Duke, and I at UT Houston and Herman Hospital. When Herman had a meltdown in 2006, he joined Fred Moore, Laura Moore, and several others across the street at Methodist Hospital as the medical director of the surgical ICU and the associate program director of the general surgery residency. In 2011, he was recruited to NYU's School of Medicine, where he served as chief of trauma and emergency surgery for Bellevue Hospital Center. In 2014, he was recruited back to Houston by Dr. Ken Maddox to Baylor College of Medicine and Ben Taub Hospital as the chief of acute care surgery. His parents' health was failing, and this gave him the opportunity to return to Texas to be close to his family. In December 2018, a headhunter approached him about Grady. After not hearing anything for several months, he bought a house in Houston in March 2019. But Grady called in April. Rob started at Grady October 22nd, 2019 as the senior vice president and chief acute care surgery. Rob met his better half, Mel Burns, in 2016 in Las Vegas. This time, what happened in Vegas didn't stay in Vegas, thank heavens. A long distance relationship between San Francisco and Houston eventually led to Mel moving to Houston. They became engaged on Mel's 50th birthday in 2018 in the Seychelles. They were married in Napa in August 2019 with Boogie, he's the one on the right, as the ring bearer. Frankie joined the family this past year. Rob definitely has a fun side. An accomplished skier, he can make his way down nearly any block. I know, I've skied with him. He definitely enjoys a good meal and a great bottle of wine. The first time we went to dinner was at Citronelle in DC. We've had many more memorable dinners since then, and many memorable bottles of wine. He loves to travel, and when you call him, you never know whether you're bringing him in Italy or the Hamptons. But most important, he is a great friend, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Samuel Robert Todd, President of Southwestern Surgical Congress. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks, Chris, for that virtual introduction from what I presume is probably smoky Sacramento right now, secondary to Lake Tahoe. It's really a true honor to be here and a true privilege. The first time I came to Southwest Surgical was in 2000. The meeting was in the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs, and Victor Yanis was the president back then. I was a fourth-year resident, and I think, I don't really recall, but I think I was talking about the futility of SCDs and why they didn't work because of non-compliance from the patients, et cetera, et cetera. So flash forward to 2003, like Chris said, I just finished my surgical critical care fellowship in Oregon, and I went to UT Houston, and that's when I met Fred. Those of you who know Fred is a gregarious, engaging person. I think people spoke earlier about Fred. I think Laura spoke about Fred a little bit, and he's just really an amazing individual. For my life as a mentor and a friend and a colleague, Fred has always been there and has really been an amazing person to me. Fred is the one who told me to join Southwest Surgical. And then Fred said, Rob, don't just join it, get involved in Southwest Surgical. That's how this is always going to happen, so get involved. And that's exactly what I did. If it weren't for Fred, I wouldn't be standing here today as president. And I'm happy to say I think I'm the longest serving tenured president because of the pandemic, going on 2.5 years. So I apologize to you that I ate into some of your time. But for those of you who don't know, the Southwest Surgical is a pretty fascinating society. It's got its origins back in 1948. And it was really at the Southeastern Surgical Society, their meeting in Miami. And Doctors Beasley and Sanders from Atlanta and Memphis approached Dr. Stuck and said, you know what? The southwestern part of the United States is the only region that doesn't have a surgical society. You should go back and start one. And that's exactly what he did. Stuck went back to San Antonio, and he reached out to his friends and colleagues. They were all orthopedic surgeons. And so if you look at the initial leadership of this society, it's kind of fascinating. Most of them were all orthopedic surgeons secondary to that connection. The mission and vision of the Southwest Surgical was pretty obvious. It's to promote and advance general surgery. And it does so through academic and community and rural surgeons, residents, fellows, medical students, and all the above. And it does so through education, advocacy, research, and innovation. And it promotes excellence in patient care and professional development in doing so. For me, the Southwest Surgical really has been an invaluable part of my life. The folks on this slide are just the tip of the iceberg of those that I consider really mentors and close friends from this society. And for them, I'm like forever grateful for those relationships and what they've done for me. I'm also tremendously grateful for my dear close friends who are providing the named lectures this time. It'll be Dr. Laura Moore providing the Thomas G. Orr Memorial Lecture, established in 1966. Dr. Mike Truitt, the Edgar J. Poth Memorial Lecture, established in 1975. And then Dr. Alicia Mangrum, the Claude H. Organ Jr. Memorial Lecture, established in 1996. Well, Mel, like Chris said, we do like to travel, and Mel and I were fortunate to be in Italy early this month with dear friends Somi, Annie, Mina, and Andrew. And we were driving back from Venice to Lake Como, and it was Mel and myself and Mina and Andrew. And Mel's driving, and I was providing a little bit of gentle critique or criticism on his driving prowess, and it didn't go over so well. And that's when Mina chimed in and chided our boyfriend Andrew and said, see, Andrew, all relationships are like this. This is how they all go. You know, this is just normal. And she and I started talking more in the backseat and talked about relationships and life and stuff and leadership. And for as long as I've known Mina, she's been kind of my professional guidance when it comes to leadership stuff. We talked a lot about different things, and somebody started thinking about it was a gentleman named Simon Sinek. And I don't know how many of you guys know Simon Sinek or his writings, but we talked a lot about this textbook or this book, Leaders Eat Last. It's an interesting book. It was his second book from 2014. And when we got back to the States and to Atlanta, Mina had sent me a couple of links from some of his talks where he kind of really delved into this book, Leaders Eat Last. The interesting about what Sinek said is he said, it's kind of fascinating that people want to listen to me talk and they read my books. He's like, I don't really have much interesting to say. He said, what I really talk about, it's all very simple. It's how to be fulfilled and how to do things that inspire us. And he says, it's really remarkable that people are going to pay money to see me or pay money to read my books. And all I'm talking about is how to be fulfilled and how to do things that inspire us. It should be so much simpler than that, he thought. Cynic also kind of points out when you think about us as humans, what drives us is very, very simple. We're social beings. So it's all dependent on the environment we're in. And that's what he really focuses on is what we end up doing is based on the environment with which we are thrust into. When you think about it from the 30,000-foot view, it truly is like this cartoon, it's fight or flight. I think he pointed out very eloquently that good people can do bad things in the wrong environment, and bad people can do good things in the right environment. So how do we focus on the environment when we're focusing on our colleagues, our partners, and our friends? Take these two scenarios, for instance. Who enjoys that serenic picture on the left? Who would prefer to be in that serenic picture on the left, or the chaotic, thanks, Bridget, or the chaotic picture on the right? I mean, I think we'd all seem to be in that the serenic picture on the left, right? And then think about from a work perspective. Look at these two pictures. The one on the left is great, high ceilings, natural light. Looks like the windows are open. There's natural elements. There's wood and plants and things like that. And everybody looks very, as the bird flies around, everybody looks very calm in that environment. And then you look at the picture on the right. It's a little bit chaotic. There's a lot of clutter, a lot of books, boxes, everything. Who doesn't want to be in that environment on the left? And for us as leaders, that's really what it's incumbent upon is how do we create that environment on the left? And when I say the environment, I don't necessarily mean the physical space. I mean all of it. The physical space, the mental space, and all of those things. How do we create that? Cynic then goes on to talk, and he talks a lot about safety and how people are successful in those environments, and it's based off of safety. Anyone who enjoys reading leadership books, they always talk about safety and how you create a safe environment for people. Another great book is Dan Coyle, The Culture Code. He really gets into safety a lot, and it's really kind of fascinating how you look at it. But he says the key is to make people feel safe, and that's where you're gonna get the most out of them. First and foremost, he says people come first. It's not the environment, it's not everything else. Go for the people first. Don't worry about the outcome, don't worry about the products. If you focus on the people, all the other stuff is gonna come around, and he really focuses heavily on that. Second, he talked about honesty. You know, how simple is honesty? Just don't lie, tell the truth. It's not that complex, but I can guarantee you everyone in this room, and myself included, tells little white lies. You know, when you're in the office and your assistant calls and says, so-and-so wants to come by and see you, and you say, tell them I'm not here. Think about the message that sends to your assistant and the rest of the society and the organization when you tell those little lies. It says that honesty is not that important, and that's really not the message any of us want to be sending in those situations. So just think about that next time your assistant asks if somebody can come see you from that perspective. Sorry, let me go back. The last one he talks about is allow others to fail. And I think this is kind of very interesting. This one really resonates well with me right now, is allowing others to fail. At Grady, we have about 120 patients on our floor services on a daily basis. And we'd always had two teams, about 60 patients on each service. We had residents and APPs. And the APPs have been wanting their own service ever since I got there for 2 years now. And for me personally, that goes against every fiber in my being to separate out the residents and the APPs. I think you should all work as a big team. But this past August 1st, we said, okay, let's try it and see how it happens. Before we did that, I met with the APPs and I said, look, if we're gonna do this, you're gonna own that service. You're gonna own those 60 patients. The residents aren't bailing you out. You're gonna figure out how to cover on the weekends, how to cover on the holidays. I was like, if someone calls in sick, someone's gonna come in and help out. So you're gonna have to work that out. And I will tell you, it's been absolutely amazing to me to watch that since you gave them that opportunity to fail. The accountability has been incredible. And they've done an amazing job in a short month, basically. That service has turned around, the census is down, and they're kind of moving things forward. And it was all by allowing them the opportunity to fail. Cynic kind of closed out a lot of stuff, and he said, you know, the real concept is safety. How do you be vulnerable in yourself and give of yourself and let people know that you're there for them? He focuses on leaders eat last. This comes from the military, where soldiers always align by rank order to eat. That means officers eat after enlisted men. And if you just say that loud and think about that for a second, if I let you eat before me and be guaranteed a meal, and I may not get a meal, think about the safety that that gives them, that knowing that you're looking out for them from that perspective. It's pretty incredible, and it's probably missing in a lot of our institutions and a lot of places out there. The other thing Cynic really talks about is your jobs and loving your job. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but if you think about it in the audience right now, if I said, how many of you love your job? I don't think everybody in this room would raise their hand and say, I love my job. And he says the fact that people don't love their job is pretty ironic that not everyone can say, I love my job. And I thought that was pretty interesting. It resonated with me. Like Chris showed the picture of my parents on the left, Bill and Jerry, my father loved his job. And he talked about it all the time. He would tell you he loved his job no matter what. He was a chemical engineer, like she said, and he worked at this plant for his entire career. until he retired in the late 70s. And I can't think of a single time I would talk to my dad that he didn't talk about how much he loved his job. The other thing my dad really loved was life and family. And the most important person to him was my mom, his wife. But he loved those two things more than anything, family, and he loved his job. So when I started thinking about this talk and everything, I sat there and thought, what did my dad do to be able to make that work for his family and for his job? And really what he did was create space. And I had not heard of this terminology of creating space until I started preparing for this talk. But out of curiosity, how many in the room have heard the term creating space? So a couple of you guys, but not a lot. For those of you who don't know, creating space is really opening up your time, energy, and physical space to allow room to live, create, and enjoy life. And when we think about creating space, it's not just the physical space, it's the mental, emotional, and spiritual space. It's the digital space. The physical space is quite simple, right? I mean, that might be changing your office. It might be getting new furniture. It might be moving a new house. It's really the physical structures. I will say the key element of the physical space also is human beings. It's your work partners, your colleagues, it's your life partner, it's your friends. Look at all that physical content when you're creating space to determine what that looks like. The mental, emotional, and spiritual space all kind of goes together in my mind, but it's where you are from a headspace and how you approach life and approach things in general. The digital space, I think everybody can appreciate that this day and age. For me, the digital space in my mind is social media. It's been over 5 years since I quote unquote quit social media. And I can tell you, I've never looked back or thought twice about it. I'm not on it at all. Do I ever go on it whenever someone sends me a link? I do, but I just don't think much about it. And I think I've done okay not being on social media. It's worked out okay for me. So think about that. I will tell you, if you're interested in the whole concept of social media and quote unquote quitting social media, Cal Newport is a sociologist. He has a TEDx talk that says it's entitled "Why You Should Quit Social Media." It's about 13 to 14 minutes, and it's absolutely fascinating. I can see Jamie cringing as I say all this right now, so I apologize, Jamie. But they go into the psychology and the science behind social media and what it looks like, and it's really a great 13-minute view if you want to watch that. So what are you holding on to that really prevents you from creating space? Look at this room right here. How many people in this room has had their life feel like this room? I know mine has. When things are cluttered, they aren't all together, and it just doesn't all make sense. And it's tough when you're in that situation, but you have to get out of that situation by creating space. If we think about our lives in general, there's only a finite amount of time, a finite amount of space that we have in our lives to devote to things. It's not an endless time bucket or an endless opportunity for us to do things. So you have to be able to determine where you're gonna put that space and how to utilize it. When we get bogged down and get stuck in that clutter situation, you don't have time to grow, you don't grow professionally, your relationships don't grow, and you don't expand your life beyond that. So you need to create space. Those times when you get in that room there where it's all cluttered and you're having difficulty, the best thing to do is have some introspection. And it's probably reasonable to have introspection off and on throughout your life just routinely. And when I say introspection, it really does mean look at all those elements we talked about from space. Look at the physical environment, look at the mental environment, the emotional environment. Really do a critical assessment of what your space looks like and how do you go from there. So in preparing for this talk, I was looking at different ways to create space, and there's a lot of literature out there. And some of these things I was already doing, and I can guarantee you a lot in the room are already doing them now. I just hadn't really thought of it from this perspective. And others I never really thought much about. And this talk kind of made me think more about maybe I should look at some of these. I think Mel could tell you for sure. I definitely don't do all these, and I don't do the ones I do terribly well sometimes. But it really does provide you an opportunity to expand your time and your space from that perspective. So we'll go through these one by one. The one with an asterisk we'll talk about a little bit more later, so I won't go into too much detail. The first one, declutter physical and mental space. Like I said, we already talked about a little bit, but keep what's important and get rid of the rest. Creating space by developing a morning routine. We'll talk more about that. Practice gratitude and learn the art of contentment. I think this one's fantastic. When I first read this, I thought about the concept of greed begets greed. And when we're not talking about greed, I think we always look for the next best thing in our minds. If we have this, we want that right above it. Take the time to stop wanting that next best thing and focus on where you are then and have gratitude and contentment for what you have at that point in time. Embrace procrastination sometimes. Procrastination is fantastic. If you use it appropriately. It can also be disastrous if you don't use it appropriately. But I will say procrastination actually puts things in perspective. Something that seemed incredibly, critically important may not be that important after you procrastinate a little while. Thereafter, that even further, it may not even be important at all, it may not even matter. So procrastination can be useful. And for some people, it's when they do their best work. So think about that. Say no when you must. More to come on that. Leverage the 80-20 rule. This is my absolute favorite one of all these. I think I've practiced my entire professional career and just never thought much about it, but we'll talk more about that. We'll also talk more about managing expectations. Have discerning taste. This one's a pretty obvious one, but for me, I probably have the worst sweet tooth I can think of. But do I want to have that so-so piece of cake, or do I want to waste those calories on a really great dessert? Have discerning taste, weed out the stuff that's not so important in your life, and focus on the stuff that is really of highest caliber and quality. Go on a digital detox. I already spoke to that from my perspective, but it's beyond that. I think if everyone, if I ask you all to pull out your phone right now and look at the apps on your phone, I guarantee you have tons of apps. A lot of them you never even look at. And the ones you do look at, you spend too much time and don't focus on the other things in the moment. I guarantee you when we're all at dinner, you can look at your phone, look around the room, everyone's on their phone at dinner. That's just kind of the routine these days. That's what they do. I think Mel's and my best meals are when one of us forgets our phone or we don't have our phones at dinner, because then you just like lose that entire environment and you talk more about everything. Be mindful in the moment. We'll talk more about that. Overcome scarcity thinking. The concept of there's a fixed pie and either I get or you get. Someone always loses when you have that scarcity thinking. So stop thinking that way and look outside the box and how can we alter that concept? The next two kind of loop together: indulge in simple pleasures and understand how to be happy. I think those are pretty common sense and pretty obvious, but it gets back to that contentment and living in the moment and appreciating everything you have at that point in time. The next one, admit when you don't know. We'll talk more about that. And lastly, do what you want so long as you know no harm. And that one's pretty interesting, to be in a room with a bunch of physicians. It's essentially the Hippocratic Oath for everyone else. First, do no harm. So if you're interested in the concept of creating space, I'll just mention this book real quick, Creating Space to Thrive by Courtney Kinney. It's also a great read, kind of focuses on some of these topics and concepts, but it's very interesting if you're interested in this talk. So creating space by developing a morning routine. Who in the room has a morning routine by show of hands? Yeah, so Bridget, like when you do your morning routine, how do you feel? I think that's the key, is when you go through your morning routine, you feel great. I feel fantastic if I do my morning routine. It puts me in the proper headspace for the rest of the day, and I move forward much better than I would have otherwise. And the great thing about morning routine is it doesn't have to be complex. It actually can be quite simple, and it's not one size fits all. It's different for all of us. When I'm actually on my morning routine is I'd get up at 4 in the morning, I'd do some emails, eat a little bit of breakfast, and go work out before work. If I work out before work, it's such a noticeable difference for me. My mind is in a totally different place. The funniest thing about that is some of my colleagues, Drew Davis being primary, they can tell you when I haven't worked out in the morning. My attitude at morning report, my vigor and my bite is just a little bit different if I haven't worked out. It's pretty obvious. So get a morning routine and focus on it from that perspective. The other thing a morning routine does for you, it allows you to have an early success. In the military, that morning routine is you make your bed. Admiral McCraven talked about this whole concept of making your bed. He said it's incredibly simple. You wake up, you roll out of bed, you make it. It's very simple to do. It's not a hard task, and it's a very short time frame. It doesn't take a lot of work, but it's a success early in the morning, and it moves your day forward. So make your bed. Next, say no when you must. This one is very entertaining to me because it's so hard to say no. I guarantee everyone in this room, we struggle to say no. We don't want to say no to people. And why is that? There's probably a lot of different reasons. One of the biggest things people talk about is it's a sign of aggression. And aggression typically has a negative connotation. To tell someone no is a little bit aggressive, believe it or not. I think more importantly, when you say something no, you feel like you're letting someone down. And I think most of us inherently don't want to let people down, especially friends and family. So learn how to say no, but you have to get past that concept of I'm letting somebody down. I think for a lot of the residents and the junior faculty in the room, saying no is also almost like admitting defeat, saying I can't do it. And I think none of us want to have our colleagues or our peers think we can't do something. So it's challenging. So how can we say no and say no effectively? And these are 7 highly effective tips they say for successful people in saying no. But first and foremost, just say it. Don't beat around the bush. Don't procrastinate. Often less is more. You don't have to go into the reasons why. Just say no. Number 2 is be assertive and courteous. Pretty straightforward. Number 3, understand people's tactics. So understand if you're being manipulated or what the reason is behind that request. Sometimes it's something you don't need to worry about or shouldn't have to think about. And if you understand the tactics, it might put your headspace differently when you're going to say no. Number 4, set boundaries. I think that's important. We heard about that a little bit ago, but obviously have boundaries in all your relationships. It doesn't matter what they are. And then number 5 is put the question back on the person asking. And this is probably the most effective one when you look at the literature. It's if someone says, hey, can you do this next week? To come back and say, no, I can't do it next week, but I can actually do it 3 weeks from today. So put it back in a time reference or a frame point that works for you. Now they have to say no to you, so it reverts that back to them, and it can be highly effective in that decision-making process. Number 6 is be firm. Don't feel like you have to waffle. Don't feel like you have to make an excuse, and don't feel like you have to meet in the middle. Be firm when you say no. And the last one is also incredibly important, I think, be selfish. And I think it sounds bad to say be selfish, but I always say you're going to look out for yourself better than anyone else is. So don't hesitate to be selfish when saying no. So as I mentioned, my favorite creating space, leveraging the 80-20 rule. I think if you talk to any of my partners at work, I probably mention 80-20 rule at least once a day, if not several times a day. And what is that concept? It's 20% of the efforts going to result in 80% of results. And I think if you think about it in the room, that definitely applies to most of our lives. They also call it the Pareto principle, named after Vilfredo Federico Tommaso Pareto. And he was an Italian born in 1948. He went on to become a famous Italian philosopher and economist. And legend has it that Pareto noticed that out of his pea plants, that 80% of productivity came from 20% of the pea plants. So 20% of pea plants would produce 80% of the productive pods. He then took it even further to look at it even beyond that. And he noticed that basically when you look at Italy, 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the population. So he kind of had this whole concept of looking at the differential, equations, differential numbers. And that's what he realized, this 80-20 rule. It's not just in his head. If you look at all these other things, they've done a lot of business studies. You can see 20% of the sales reps generate 80% of the sales. 20% of the customers buy 80% of the products and result in 80% of profits. 20% of software bugs cause 80% of crashes. In our world, 20% of patients use 80% of our healthcare spending. So how do we use the 80-20 rule in our lives? First and foremost, just be appreciative that 20% of your effort is going to present 80% of your productivity. And use that in prioritizing tasks. Maybe that's in using resources. Maybe you do the 80-20 rule of that. I can tell you in my personal life and work now, it's how I invest time in my colleagues and my junior partners. I focus on the 20% of those partners that are going to give me the 80% back, not the rest of the 80% that are going to give me the 20% back. Manage expectations. I think Eric Silverfine was a partner of mine at Baylor, and Eric always talked about managed expectations, especially in regard to residents. Set the expectation correct from the get-go. If you go into something and you have these grandiose expectations and they're totally off base, you're going to be disappointed every day, every time. So manage those initial expectations and get to a point of realism when you think about it, so that whenever it comes to fruition or doesn't, you're in the proper mind and headspace. Be mindful and in the moment. What do you want for dinner? I would argue this is probably said in every household at least once or twice a day. I know it is in our household. And it causes probably more angst, that one question about what do you want for dinner, than any other question we talk about in the day. And my answer typically is, I don't care. Flashback, we're in the backseat, me and I are talking about relationships and stuff, and that comes up, and I'm talking about, what do you want for dinner? And I said something about, I don't care, and Mina's like, well, Rob, what do you think that imparts to Mel when you say, I don't care? And it hit me like a ton of lead bricks. I was like, oh, it's unimportance. And she's like, exactly. What you're saying is that part of my life is not important. And she's like, that's not what you want to say. And I started to say, absolutely not what I want to say, but it's just what I've said at that point in time. So it gets to the concept, decisions. There's a funny little story that me and I were talking about, and there's an elderly gentleman, and he's talking to his grandson about marriage. And he said, when we're going to get married, his grandmother, his soon-to-be wife, said, this is going to be perfect. You're going to make all the big decisions in the relationship, and I'll just make the little ones. And he looked at his grandson, and it's an amazing. In 43 years of marriage, there's not been one big decision yet. And I think that's the key. It's decision-making, thinking how those decisions fit in it and how many decisions you can make in a day. Cornell research looked at it and they said 35,000 remotely conscious decisions each day, each one of us make. 226.7 about food alone. What do you want for dinner? And then you get bogged down by about 70 serious decisions every day. So decision-making is just like working on the gym. It's muscle fatigue. There's decision-making fatigue, and at some point you burn out on that decision-making. So how do you make better decisions? And these are a list of different concepts to make smart decisions by what they say are highly successful people. But the first one is turn small decisions into routines. Take it off the table and don't make it a difficult decision. If you think about Steve Jobs, he famously always wore that black turtleneck. He didn't have to decide what to wear every day he went to work. And that's exactly why he did it. Think about for us in the room who are surgeons, what a fantastic thing to be able to wear scrubs every day. If you don't have to dress up, you don't have to think about what to wear. It takes one more decision off the table and just makes it something very routine and standard. Make big decisions in the morning. We already talked about decision-making fatigue. So focus those big important decisions in the morning. Don't put those in the afternoon. When you're strategically thinking about meetings, work meetings, put the important stuff in the morning. Get it over with in the morning when you're still at your highest point in making decisions. Pay attention to your emotions. I guarantee every one of us in this room has made a decision at the heat of the moment or in a bad mood, and it's usually catastrophic. So when you're in a bad mood or not in a good emotional state, step back, try to avoid major decisions and focus those on another time. Evaluate your options objectively. Obviously, if you can look at all the data you can bring in, it's going to allow you to make a better decision. And then sleep on it. Sometimes that'll provide you better clarity. But when you sleep on it, you can't do it for too long. That brings what they call analysis paralysis or the decision of indecision, but you just kind of waffle and you make no headway. Using exercise to recharge, just like we talked about fight or flight, believe it or not, they've done science, and when you're making large decisions, you have a massive cortisol release. So if you can find time to exercise or build that in your routine, eat up some of that cortisol, you're going to be in a better headspace when it goes to make those large decisions. Go back to your moral compass. I'd love to think for all of us that if we go to our morals, it's going to lead us in the right direction. So go back to your moral compass. And then seek outside counsel, get different perspectives. It's going to be incredibly invaluable to have other people's perspective because they're going to look at it differently than you did and provide you data points that you would not have thought about. And then reflect on your previous decisions. Think about the good decisions you made and the bad ones, the failures and the successes, and use those when making future decisions from that perspective. And lastly, admit when you don't know. There's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know. If you think about trying to know everything, it is so taxing. It takes so much energy. Number one, it takes energy to know everything. Number two, to try to stay on top of everything and not have people bother you about it. And then number three, it often puts you in situations to be in a conversation or an environment that you don't need to be in because they think you know everything. So learn how to say no, and then also admit when you don't know once you've done that. So making space, what does that do for you overall? I mean, there's a lot of different things about creating space that gives us room. It gives you room to do all of these things. And I think anyone can look at all these and go, yeah, that absolutely applies. Some of these are physical, some of these are mental, some of these are emotional. But when I was wrapping up this talk, I was thinking, what has creating space done for me? And Chris kind of alluded to this in my talk, in her talk, but for me, creating space professionally has allowed me to do all those things I just mentioned, create, love, learn, work with people, purchase, things like that, at three amazing institutions. At Bellevue Hospital Center in New York City, Ben Taub Hospital in Houston, Texas, and now most recently at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. And I can tell you what I get out of working at those institutions and providing the patients we care for is so much more than I could ever give back. It's incredible to be able to work at those sorts of institutions. It's also allowed me to be in some incredible societies and organizations and meet amazing friends who are in the audience here today. Those being primarily for me, the American College of Surgeons, the Western Trauma Association, and obviously the Southwestern Surgical Congress. Thinking about creating space from that perspective, I always tell the junior partners, there are so many societies and so much out there, you can't join it all. You need to find what's going to be your home from a professional perspective and make that your home, basically. And for me, I've created that space around these three societies. And once again, I would say what I've gotten back from those societies is so much more than I could ever give to it. And then lastly, when I think of, personally, creating space for me personally has really allowed me to have some amazing journeys. I've met great friends along the way, some of you in the room here, and I've had amazing opportunities, amazing travels, amazing misadventures and some pitfalls along the way and some disasters. The Astros Game 7 of the World Series, they lost right there. But it's an amazing opportunity. Along the way, I've also been privileged to meet some amazing colleagues and partners like Chad Wilson, Mina, and Laura Moore, and different folks like that. Most importantly, obviously, I met Mel along the way and have had Mel in my life and our two French bulldogs, Boogie and Frankie, which are an amazing part of our life. And for all that stuff, I'm truly eternally grateful. So what I would say is take time and create the space. Once again, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to serve as the president of Southwestern Surgical Congress.